Pilgrim, it's so good to have you on the show today. I'm so glad that we can finally connect. This is one of those conversations I've been eager to have just because it's one of those moments where it's like this person you've connected with online, you're finally, and this is still online, but I'm seeing your face now. But you're finally connecting with in a more personal way. So I'm really happy to make this happen. How you doing, Pilgrim?
Yeah, thank you, Bradley, so much. I'm doing great. It's good to be here and looking forward to chatting.
Yeah. I think as we were just even chatting beforehand, we have a lot of just crossover mutual friends, mutual interests, and so it's good that we can finally kind of make this happen, so to speak. So before we, bear the lead anymore or get into some sort of rabbit trail, why don't you just introduce yourself, kind of where you are, your family, and kind of what is keeping you busy in this season of life?
Sure. Yeah. Uh, yeah, my name's Pilgrim Benham, which is a unique name. Grew up in a Christian hippie home, so that's where the name came from. My my parents were basically at a like a Jesus festival, and if you've seen any like Jesus
Mm,
Revolution or any of the hippie movement stuff, that was completely them.
yeah.
And so raised in a home to know the name of Christ, love the name of Christ, not love my name, but middle school was awkward. Then grew to love the name. But the idea of being a sojourner,
Yeah.
and on mission for Christ in this world, the kingdom. So
Did you
yeah,
have any weird nicknames in high
I mean,
school
you
or
can
middle
go with
school?
anything. Not really. No,
Okay.
I mean, people find nicknames for any name, but
Yeah. Anyways, keep going.
um, but yeah. So I had a like a just a radical salvation experience at the age of 17. So even though I was raised in a Christian home, my parents got divorced, and I was kind of running from Christ, seeking,
Mm,
not sure, just sort of wanted to run into the world, and Christ captured my heart. That's a longer story, but I'd say within a year or two, I graduated early. So I was involved in youth ministry right after high school. And yes, some of our church leaders saw the gift of teaching in me before I saw it, and basically
mm,
said, you should pray about, like teaching, being in ministry. And so that sort of led my wife and I eventually got married and led us to Bible college. And then we worked at our church's youth ministry for about 10 years. And whenever you talk to people who work in youth ministry, it sounds like, doing time. Like, yeah, I did 8 years. But actually really still love student ministry, love equipping youngsters, getting to see like, those first steps, those life-changing moments, their first missions trip, their first, experience here or there. Anyway, that we love doing that, and then the Lord directed us to sort of step out in faith and plant churches. So we in 2010 planted our first church in Tampa, and that church is still going today. Vibrant, awesome, growing fellowship in downtown area of Tampa. And then about 4 years into that, the Lord directed us to plant our second church, more suburban in Southwest Florida, sort of near the Sarasota
mm.
area. And yeah, we were there for almost 10 years, and sort of a difficult situation, series of events. Um, a lot of backstory here, but at the same time, the Lord was redirecting our family to North Carolina, where at the
Mm,
time I didn't know it, but now we found out my dad was in renal failure. So we got to spend
mm,
about a year and a half of really sweet time with him. He's still alive. He's hanging in there at the time of this
mm.
recording. But yeah, so that was a really restorative, sabbatical, restful season. Very surprising season. We thought it'd be longer, and we didn't know what was up. Like we weren't in pastoral ministry, and so what are we doing, Lord? And then most recently, the Lord opened a door for us to move back to our hometown, Bradenton, and work with the actual Bible college that I went to in California, Calvary Chapel, that relocated. They've been there 50 years and relocated to our hometown, which is just wild. So the president of that school asked me to come be the dean of students and teach a variety of classes and just sort of build out the student life experience for our residents. And
Mm.
it's been an adventure. So that's what I'm currently doing, and get to teach the Bible. I'm a pastor, one of the associate pastors of our church, So I get to minister there and teach on occasion in the pulpit and shepherd the flock. So God is good.
Amen. Amen. Praise the Lord for your season away, and we can get into all that. There's so many different directions I want to go now, just because of hearing your story. But like, how has it been? I mean, you just said you're in ministry still right now, associate pastoring. But how has it been, sort of being in the academic world, if I can say that, as well as just the church world? Because I've talked to some other, I don't know, theology professors and other faculty of different seminaries and institutions, and just talking about the dynamics of those two different worlds, theology in the academia and theology in the church, or on the ground, so to speak, and trying to bridge that gap. So, can you speak into that? And is there anything that you're kind of in that fairly recently, but is there anything like you've kind of noticed or gleaned?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all in that, hopefully, we're all in that persuasive mindset that we don't want the ivory tower
Yeah,
theologian divorced from the local church. That should never be the case anyway. I think we've turned that corner. There's
good.
still an important need. I would never diminish the need for academia, for theological training and education. But I think we finally turned the corner where we're like, okay, this is what this looks like. My personal master's program was cohort model. I know that seems to be the trend. Since COVID, it's trending online.
Yeah,
But my prayer and hope is that it would always be tied to the local church, and that's kind of what we're doing here. Is the integration of student life, with particularly our local church, but not divorcing the two. And I
yeah.
think I think that's hopefully I see it that we're trending in that direction, not away from it, which is I think positive.
Yeah, and there's this weird dichotomy for me, because I learned a lot. I got my master's from Midwestern. I finished that earlier this year, and I can see so much of the value of academia and academy study. However, I know that I think I learned more within the first 3 months of being a pastor than I ever did in a seminary seminar. So and
Yeah.
that's like, there's the rub, so to speak. Like, I don't know really how to bridge that gap between those two different realities, because those realities really exist. But I think what I think is most important is getting theologically or ministerially minded students opportunities, instead of to use or equip them with the ability to implement what they're being taught in real world settings, because then those academic ways in which you learn such and such doctrine or such and such thing are going to take maybe a little bit different form, or maybe it's going to be implemented different than just, here's this academic thing. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. And I mean,
So
so if you just got your, Midwestern, so that means you were in pastoral ministry,
yeah,
like parallel at the same time you're pursuing
correct.
seminary. Yeah. And see, that's
Yeah,
to me, that's the win. Yeah.
I think it is too. Because it really forced me a lot of times to, here I'm writing, some academic paper about the Trinity or something like that. How do I translate that into, like, either a Sunday school class or some sort of seminar that I can bring to a small group or whatever? Because you can, but you also can't do it in the same way. Because academic writing, of course, is going to sound a lot different. Is going to read a lot different than, just taking it to, a small group or something like that. So I think that's like the real challenge is again bringing it, again, not bringing it down like we're dumbing it down, but bringing it down in a way that is tangible, that is accessible, that makes sense, and not just makes sense that we can, that an average person, so to speak, could think logically through such and such theological tenet, but that it's accessible and it makes sense, that we can see like the resonance of it. Like, what's the relevance of this? How is this going to affect when I go to the grocery store? Like, how is this going to affect this and this part of my life? And I think that that's the challenge, but also the great joy too of doing quote unquote public theology, is like, this is kind of the things that everyone's wrestling with, and so it's kind of fun to wrestle with those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Piper, right, wrote the book, Pastor as Theologian, Theologian as Pastor, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And that's a helpful small little resource. But just that phrase, just that idea that, hey, pastors need to be theologians. Every believer needs to be a theologian at some level.
yeah. Yeah.
And so raise the bar, but also theologians need to be pastoral. So I think that's helpful.
What I also think is interesting and unique about, you know, your time in ministry, you've had, already 20 years of ministry, as you said, 10 years in two different places. And you're still kind of a young guy. So like, what are some things that you've learned over 2 decades of ministry that you would tell maybe to your 17-year-old self? What are some things that you were like, yeah, everyone has those like, man, I wish I had known this or whatever. What's something like that you wish you could tell your younger self, so to speak?
Oh man, how much time do we have in the podcast?
Yeah, this is the I'll take up the whole rest of the episode.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much. I see ministry now, and this is what I teach to my ministry students here is like ministry is kingdom work,
Mm,
and so it can happen vocationally, and yes, I'm in the camp that says we should vocationally, and pay and employ our vocational pastors. Um, but it's beyond that. It's not limited to that. And so
yeah,
ministry is kingdom work happening outside of the church, but you're doing it as unto Christ. And so that's one of the key things is it's not, yes, you're ministering to people, but I would have liked to have learned years ago, like
mm,
ministry itself is not Jesus. It's
mm,
work done, it's work. And so there's sweat and there's a beginning and an end and there's effort and that implies rest. But itself is not Christ. And there is a difference. We're doing it as unto Christ. We're ministering. We're doing work for Christ and to Christ for His glory. But we can't conflate the two. And I think that's where I may have
mm,
maybe early on, especially raising a young family, being newly married, put the higher priority on. We've heard the phrase sacrificing your family on the altar of ministry. Or ministry is the mistress. And I think we
mm,
we bristle at those terms and those concepts, and we say, well, no, not me. And yet, when we really weigh it out, is this the same? The work I'm doing, the church I'm serving, is this the same as Jesus? Is this the same as Christ's glory? Well, hopefully not. Hopefully, we can separate the two and say, uh, because otherwise, right, our identity is completely wrapped in our work and our title. And for all of us, we have a finite season. So our
mm,
seasons begin, they carry on, they end. And in my context, being out of ministry for a season, a year and a half, um, there were some definite. I knew it was coming, but there were definitely some identity questioning, like who am I? Is it enough that I'm approved unto God? Is it enough that I'm accepted in the beloved?
mm,
Am I an accepted adopted son, and that's enough? And it is, but if your identity is no, I'm a pastor for Christ, or I'm this and this, for Christ, versus just I'm in Christ, then I
mm,
think that can become an idol, and it can, like any good thing that becomes an idol, it becomes a God thing, which makes it a bad thing. So yeah, those are a couple things that I've learned. I've also learned, sheep bite, and and we as pastors are also sheep. So that means we bite, and we are also sheep. We are shepherds, but we are under the care of the good shepherd, the chief shepherd. And
mm,
so yes, we represent him, but we can also be deeply wounded and deeply hurt. Um,
mm,
and yeah, just to kind of understand that, there's you and I talked about, death by a thousand cuts.
mm.
Ministry can sometimes be, and as soon as you said that earlier, when we weren't recording yet, I just thought, like, yep, and usually those cuts are in the back. And the
Yes.
thing about
Yeah.
being stabbed in the back is, a knife blade is very thin, so there's lots of room.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, though, we shouldn't be surprised, because we're
Mm,
serving, the master who was betrayed with a kiss. He was,
mm,
abandoned by his disciples. We look at Paul, at the end of his ministry, and he seems to be like not desperate, but he's writing Timothy saying, I've only got Luke with me. Demas has abandoned me for the present world. He loved it. And all these guys have caused me trouble. Timothy, bring some clothes and and the parchments. I need the word, and I need some warmth. And
Mm.
you know what, man? You left me alone with the medical doctor. Please come. I cannot endure another day with this guy. But you know, in other words, he's in some ways, you know, isolated, and he can look back at many people that he's impacted, but also many people that have been, you know, harmful or hurtful. And so I think that's
Mm.
just a reality. You know, that's a reality that we are gonna hurt people, and we are gonna be harmed and hurt. But we're not doing it for them. You know, we're not
Mm.
in youth ministry serving the youth. Yes, they're sort of a secondary blessing, but we're serving Christ. So if it's all done to him and it's for him, um, then it's okay that we're let down. And that context could change. Now we're working with seniors instead of youngsters, you know. So yeah, those are a couple things. I could go much longer, but some
Well, no,
thoughts.
I think that's really good, and I also think, you know, we read those verses in James, like, you know, count it all joy, my brothers, when you fall into trials of various kinds, and I think the green behind your ears sort of seminarian would always identify those as, you know, crises of, you know, outside suffering, things happening in the world, or diseases or deaths, loss, those types of pains and hurts. I think what may shock and may surprise is that the trials of various kinds sometimes come from within your own flock, within your own family. And those are the things we don't often think about, or we don't often have at the tip of our tongues or at the forefront of our brains. But like, there are church hurts that come from within the church. It's not always external pressures. There's these internal pressures. And so the trials of various kind can include, you know, crises of identity, like you're talking about. And I think that's one thing that I would say too. I would just echo that sentiment, is just, we are not primarily shepherds first. We are under shepherds, yes, but I think, I can't remember who it was, but finding our identity in Christ is so important, way more important than I think I ever knew as a young guy. That
Yeah.
I'm a son of God who happens to be a minister for God, not a minister first. And that's so simple. And it sounds like I'm not trying to be, you know, some cliche podcaster saying some profound thing that's not really that profound. But I do think it is profound in the sense that it will shape the trajectory of your identity. If you think that you're a minister first, then over time, maybe it won't happen overnight, but over time, that identity is going to be held up by the ways in which you're able to perform, so to speak, ministerially, the ways in which you're able to live and live up to people's expectations of you as a minister, or even your own expectations, things that you've either explicitly heard, like this is what a pastor does, or been implicitly taught this is what a pastor does. And I even, you know, find myself wrestling with those things myself, where it's like, man,
Yeah.
how do I manage all these expectations? And so that's oftentimes where trials come from, where difficulty arises out of, which again brings us back to identity in Christ. No, you are a son of God. You are a child of God who God has called to ministry. But that son of God, that child of God, that identity comes first. And I think that everything else kind of bleeds down from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, because then your identity becomes wrapped up in the work that you do. So then
Yeah.
when you're not working, right? You're not working. Now you're you're letting the Lord down, or you know, you're letting someone down, and something's fallen through. So yeah, I just think that was such an important lesson to learn early on, is the work that we're doing. It is work, but let's keep that in its appropriate lane. This is not necessarily the one that we're working for, the one that we
Yeah.
are, you know, empowered by.
Yeah.
This is you know, this is effort and sweat and blood, and tears and all the things. But Christ is faithful. Christ is enough. And one day he's called us, you know, he's in a sense called us to rest now, right? We enter
Mhm.
into that rest. We already have through his blood, but there is a day coming, you know, of complete rest. So I think just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what, you know, you kind of almost mentioned it. Maybe you were thinking it, but that verse in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul's like, you know, I worked harder than everyone. I was this
Hmm.
really hard, a hard worker, an apostle for Jesus Christ. But all the while, he goes on. I'm probably butchering the verse, but like he goes on and says like I knew it was Christ who was working in me. It wasn't really his energy. It was the energy, we could say, of Christ and his word and spirit working through him for the benefit and the betterment of the churches that he was serving. And I think that is such a paradigm shifting way to look at it, because yeah, like you're saying, like ministry is arduous. It'll be toilsome. It's not, kick your feet back and take it easy sort of line of work. It's not an occupation or vocation, I should say, that you can really fit into that mold. But also, it's one where a lot of those joys, maybe they'll come through tears, but they are joys that are deeply felt, that are deeply resonant because of who's actually doing the work in and through you. And it's Christ through his word and spirit, which is, what a marvel, what a mystery that we get to take part in that.
Yeah, amen. That's awesome.
So you mentioned, well, we'll just kind of get right into it. Well, you mentioned, being led out of the last place that you were, and there was, some difficulty that came along with that. Can you kind of just share, like, you can get into however detailed you want, but just some of the difficulties with being maybe led out of a ministry situation that, like maybe beforehand you were like, I would never want to leave this, but then suddenly that window, or that door sort of shut on you and you were kind of, or maybe it opened, I don't know. But however you want to say the metaphor, where it kind of, maybe it took you off guard and maybe it shocked you, maybe it surprised you. And also just how you can see how you saw how God was using it actually, actually in the moment. Yeah, it sucked. It was horrible. But maybe you're a couple years removed and you can kind of see some of the ways in which God was already using some of that to better you, to maybe strengthen your family, or however you can perceive that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, thankfully, no, no suffering or um, trial is wasted in the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right.
I think of Joseph, who would have recounted, as he's now prime minister, second in command over Egypt under Pharaoh. I wonder if he looked back and was like, wow, the dreams are now, even before that, before the dreams were fulfilled with his brothers and father, but like, leading up to that, as he's going from literally the pit to the palace,
Hmm.
is he thinking like, the is he understanding conceptually Genesis 50 verse 20, right? Like
Hmm.
before that, like after the fact, he could say, what you meant for evil, God has worked for good.
Yeah.
And so I think the hard part is when we're in the thick of the trial, of the pain, the confusion, really, um, and I think that's the bigger thing is the confusion
Hmm.
in trials. That's why I think, is it Peter or James? It's not an alien thing happening. I think it's Peter. It's not like the word is like in the Greek, it's like xenos. It's like an alien thing to you.
Hmm.
Don't be surprised at the painful trial. It's as if something strange or alien or
Yeah.
obscure were happening to you. This is not something from the outside that comes in, but in the thick of it, we're like, man, this is chaos. This is confusing. I don't know what's happening. So I think the realization that God does work all things together for good for those who love Him, who are called according to His purposes. That talk about cliche. We can sometimes misappropriate that verse and just think that God's going to work my flat tire, my backache, But I think in the bigger cosmic sense of where Romans 8 is kind of setting that up, like all of creation is groaning. All of the tears are going to be wiped away. There will be no more mourning. That's a cosmic thing. And yes, that's a personal thing. But to answer your question, I think, looking back at some of the stuff we went through in the moment, we were like, what is going on? We're
Hmm.
not sure what's happening. We had planted a church with a very kind of specific direction, and we had brought on some leadership and sort of were reforming in a little bit of a different direction than we started out with. And that just theologically caused tension. And then relationally, there was not a lot of trust. So, are you familiar with Patrick? I can't remember how to say his last name. Lencioni, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. Are you familiar with that book?
I've heard of that book. I've not read it.
Okay. So it's a great read. It's real quick, but he basically builds this idea that the baseline for any team, and you can apply this in ministry or in work dynamics. And he's not necessarily doing this from a Christian perspective, but more for like work team dynamics. But the baseline, the foundation of this pyramid is we have to have trust. And when that is eroded or evaded or never built, you have an absence of trust. And an absence of trust leads people to artificial harmony. And so he kind of develops that idea, but that's essentially what we had. We had, and I think everyone who was involved in the situation could watch this right now and nod their head and say, there was definitely like a lack of trust with me with a lack of trust with some of our leaders and some folks. And so, yeah, it essentially came to a head where there were accusations thrown and just a very traumatic situation, especially for my wife who was involved in some of it. And so for me, it was more we've got to handle this biblically. We have to handle this disagreement in a way that honors Matthew 18, in a way that, I think it was interpreted as, the process. All we care about is the process, when really it's like, well, if it's unbiblical, if we're doing things
Mm.
unbiblical and we're not honoring even like some of the confessions, like the 1689, then what are we doing? If we're not going to honor the word or even the confession that we ascribe to uphold, then what are we doing? So again, I think it comes down to a disagreement of interpreting certain verses, and that's a real thing. You know doctrine unites us and it also divides, and I don't think the dividing part is that bad. I think
Mm.
there's a reason why we don't fellowship with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a reason
Yeah.
why we don't
Yeah.
fellowship with the Kingdom Hall folks that come to our door and invite us on Saturdays. And so, doctrine unites us, but it also divides. And I think that can be a good thing, like I just mentioned, but it can also be tragic, where we like the Pharisees, strain out a gnat and swallow a
Mm.
camel. So yeah, so for us, it was like, all right, I can in good conscience continue on even at the church we planted if we're not just going to honor, the basic building blocks of Matthew 18 and church discipline and whatnot. So, I resigned, just very sad, didn't want to do it. Also didn't want to strong arm our leadership and demand anything. I just don't think
Mm.
that's the example of Christ. He's standing before his accusers and he doesn't, call out their sins, which would have been very easy. And so instead he's meek, and so I think that was what I was trying to respond with is, let's do this wisely and Christ-like, and we don't have to defend ourselves. There's a different narrative out there that is not real, not right, but we're not going to try to go and fight that. So
Mm.
yeah, very challenging time for us, but in God's providence, what was really cool is even before all of this came out, about a week before, it seemed like my wife and I had this different. And it's the hard thing, like following the Lord. You know, when do you know He's redirecting you? And so for us, it was just conversation, prayer, just sort of a sensing, and then knocking on those doors. So I actually, like, I'm being cryptic here, but my wife was like, "You just finished your master's degree. I'm proud of you. I think you should go for your doctorate, and we should transition out of pastoral, you being a pastor, out of pastoral ministry and into academia. And just, I love developing people. I love training. That's my bread and butter. So to do that, I would want a doctorate. I want a doctorate in ministry. So where do we go?" And so literally we talked about Midwestern and really fond of their program there with their D-men. We talked about RTS. We talked about a bunch of different places, but we sort of landed with Southeastern as an idea in Wake Forest, North Carolina. And incidentally, one of my elders who helped us plant the church had moved there about during COVID, about 4 years prior. And of course, my dad lived there. So yeah, we were already ready, sort of locked and loaded to meet
Mm.
with the elders and kind of tell them, hey, and the deacons and say, hey, we're praying about this summer. And then when all this happened, it was like, well, I guess it's time to move a little sooner than summer.
Hmm.
And so yeah, so very difficult season, wrought with a lot of pain and a lot of confusion, I think is one of the big words. But in the midst of it now, again, now we can look back and say, oh, okay, the Lord was redirecting us to get out of ministry for a season, to sort of work on our hearts and healing, and to get us maybe indirectly, like God could have prevented the famine in Joseph's day, but it was, when you look at the summary of what happened to Joseph, like in the Psalms, this is, generations later, hundreds of years later. David's summary is that this was how the Lord was going to deliver Israel.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, the line of Messiah is not through Joseph, it's through Judah. So what was the whole thing about Joseph? The whole story was God's, sort of indirect way of caring for Israel during that famine. And God could have prevented the famine, but, there's always those questions, I think, when we endure hardship or hurt. We're like, why did this happen? And Paul would admonish us, you don't ask why, because God's doing that in Israel, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. We ask who, Second
Hmm.
Corinthians 1. We despaired of life, but we are able to comfort others with the same comfort we've received. So whenever my wife gets tempted to ask that, or our kids, why did we go through
Hmm.
that, Dad? I can say, no, wrong question. And they go, I know. It's not why, it's who. But really, who are we going to be used by the Lord to comfort? How will the Lord use this? Again, not to build a platform or some message, but there's literally going to be people that need ministry. And we can say, I was comforted by the Holy Spirit, by the Lord, in a very, very real way in that hardship. And I don't know exactly what you're going through, but this is what God comforted me with, his truth. Now I can comfort you with that same comfort that I've received. So it's not a why, it's a who.
Hmm.
And
That's good.
yeah, so in the midst of all that, we're, thanking God and humbled. And we thought it would be a longer season. We didn't think we'd be back in ministry as soon. And we've even had some of the challenges of like, okay, can we get back in ministry this quick? Are our hearts ready? Um, Obviously the Lord sees we're fit for it, but are we
Hmm.
there mentally?
Yeah.
So that's been the more bigger challenge as of late.
Hmm. There's there's a heaviness to what you've just elaborated on, but I also think there's a grace to it too, in just the sense that you can perceive maybe some of what God's doing. I think that's always the challenge, right? Like we don't have the perception to see God's providence in real time, and maybe even sometimes not even in hindsight. It only comes as God reveals that to us, um, and sometimes He does, and sometimes He doesn't. But I think what you're saying is so apt and so true. It's not the why or the what's occurred, but the who that is behind it, but maybe not even behind it all at the time, but just the who that it's directing our hearts towards. The verse that you mentioned is in First Peter, is 4:12, and he says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Strange, that something strange is that word xenos, foreign, it's alien. Um, and oftentimes it is. Oftentimes trials are foreign to us. At least that's how we
Yeah.
respond to them. That's how we react to them. And I think your word there is very apt. Confusion. Um, these strange alien things often are the most confusing things of all. We have no idea what those UAPs are, UFOs or whatever. It's confusing. We have no idea what to do with them. We have no idea how to make sense of them. Is this, I don't want to get us rabbit trailed on some, conspiracy theory. Is this, a government conspiracy, or is this just a glitch in the camera, and I think we can view suffering in the same way. Like, what kind of glitch is this? What kind of, this
Yeah.
is not supposed to be here. And I think Peter's words are apt because they're not just Peter's, they come from real suffering. And he's realized probably better than a lot of disciples that this stuff is not strange to disciples of God, to disciples of Christ. But I also think whenever someone mentions stuff like this, especially when it's like confusion and suffering and trial, and also we could say disagreement within a church setting, it always makes me think of Acts 16, or I should say Acts 15 and 16,
Yeah.
when Paul and Barnabas have their very infamous split. And I did a long study on that one time to try and, because, people are always like, who was right? Was it Barnabas? Was it Paul? And I think the best answer is they both were. They were both right. And whether you're siding with Paul or Barnabas, I don't think really matters as much as the fact that I always try and picture, Joe Schmo, Jane Doe in the pews in Jerusalem. What a confusing time that must have been for them. What a confusing time it must have, even for the Galatian churches, Paul and Barnabas, they had just come home from ministering in that area of Galatia, those churches up there. And then they come home, and those two superstar missionaries now have this very public ministerial divorce. What did those churches think about
Yeah.
what they had just heard? And I think that's why, whether it was Paul's ambition or not, I'm not sure, but we do know that those are the exact same churches that he goes back and visits on the next visit with Silas and eventually with Timothy. And it's also not by accident. Number one, not just because of the Jerusalem Council, but number two, I think maybe because he wanted to reaffirm what was just teaching. Like, hey, this other stuff, it doesn't affect the abiding truth of the word. This is what matters. Stick to this, cling to this. This is and yes, the doctrine of justification that they just talked about in Jerusalem, but also the fact that this revelation, the Greek word, the kerygma, the proclamation of the truth of Jesus, this is what matters. Whether, me and Barnabas are chummy or not, that isn't as, that's not as eternal. That's not as weighty. It's weighing on people. But I always go back to that time because I think, man, how confusing that must have been. And I think what rises to the surface out of that, obviously, is just it's the truth of the word. That's what matters. And may we, whether we, sort of have to die to our ambitions or our dreams or our aspirations, or not. I always go back to that phrase, 3 John. I think it's verse 7. 3 John 7 or whatever, where it's for the sake of the name. And I love that phrase. I think that's the King James way of saying it. But for the sake of the name, they were doing what they were doing. And I always think about that. Like, it doesn't really matter. For the sake of the name, let all the cards fall where they may. And I think even in the confusing times, I think that's true.
Yeah, and you're right. So that's a great example of, it's not a black or white issue. So,
Yeah.
John Mark, we could deduce from that situation that he bailed. He left on the missions trip and he bailed. He's not trustworthy. So, but that's not a black or white sin issue. And so I think, if we're diagnosing an electrical, there's an electrical shortage that caused a fire. Someone could come in and they could say, let me diagnose this. Here's what went wrong.
Yeah.
Literally, this cable was not connected. That's what caused the fire. When we talk about church hurt and disagreements, where there really could be sin and misunderstanding all around, it's not as diagnosable as an electrical short circuit. So you've got dynamics there where you've got leadership that could have made a mistake. You've got the congregation that could have made a mistake. You've got nuances between communicating and hurt feelings and misunderstanding. So there's all of that's in the mix. And I think you're right. The bigger picture is for the sake of the name, for Christ's glory. And of course, you see the eventual restoration of John Mark there at the end of same area, 2 Timothy Paul saying he's useful. He's useful to me in ministry. He wasn't useful for a little while, but you see that restoration, which I'm so thankful for. I'm so thankful we get that little glint of like, there's some sort of, restoration that happened. We don't
Yeah.
see it with Barnabas. We don't actually hear from Barnabas, I don't think, again in the scripture after that at all.
Yeah.
He just sort of fades into obscurity. But I'm just so thankful we did get a little bit of restoration with John Mark. So, I mean, that's what we want to see. We don't want to see. Hopefully, people don't want to see arguments end in devastation, but in restoration. So
Hmm.
that's the hard part with people. Again, we're not dealing
Yeah.
with clinical. Now, sometimes it is. I mean, if a guy is committing adultery and he's unrepentant, I mean that is actually a little easier to diagnose, like an electrical shortage.
Yeah.
But when it's just nuance and hurt feelings and he said, she said, it just becomes There's my point is there's nuance and dynamics that
Correct.
are deep.
So the other point that I wanted to maybe unpack if we can, but is because I've thought a lot about this being I'm 6 years into ministry, and going through or seeing what occurred with my mom was really I should have probably explained because we were talking beforehand, but maybe if you're just jumping into the podcast you have no idea what I'm talking about. But my mom, she had this very devastating mental health collapse. She's been involved with my dad's ministry for 30 years. 30 odd years of pastoral ministry. All I have to say. When I saw what happened with my mom, I was obviously, and it was kind of like preceding my entry into ministry where I am now in Pennsylvania. And so it was kind of, I don't know, it was on my heart, this notion of quote unquote protecting my wife, who is, with me in ministry, but she's also, um, just feel like sometimes pastors' wives don't have the quote unquote voice that maybe they should, or maybe other people in the church have. And so my question to you was, as you were going through this really devastating time, surprising time, where maybe it did feel strange and confusing, what were some ways that either you ministered to your wife or your wife was ministered to? Because I think sometimes, and I think, I don't know, I don't want to speak for my wife, Natalie, but I think she would echo that, like, sometimes the pastors' wives are just kind of there. And that's not really unfortunate. Like, I've always thought, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but I've always thought for as many networks and resources that we have for pastors, like there's a dearth in the market. And I'm not like, trying to, trademark this. So, whoever publisher wants to do it, fine. But like there's a dearth in the market for pastors' wife resources in terms of like, how do they understand their calling?
Yeah.
And are they called, or are they just kind of there, like beside that? Like how lots of nuance and dynamic there. But anyways, how were you, or how was someone able to minister to your wife as because she's seeing your hurt from afar, which is always an interesting
Yeah.
situation. I always remember. I'll be quiet in a second. But I always remember, like, when my mom was going through her very, very sharp and severe depression. It's really interesting to me because depression is one of the things I kind of liken it to secondhand smoke, where you're seeing it, but you're also feeling the effects of it, and
Hmm.
you are not always able to do anything about it. And that's kind of the same thing for pastors' wives as they watch their husbands go through really difficult ruts and gutters of pastoral ministry, where they're seeing it and they're feeling the effects of it, and they don't really have any ability to do anything about it per se. So anyways, that was a long rambling question, but hopefully
No,
it made
that's
sense.
that, no, that's a great analogy, the secondhand smoke, to observe it and to be impacted by it. I think we should brand this book. We should call it Beside the Ox.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, that's great.
m-
That's
my
great.
wife and I talked about writing that book years ago, Beside the Ox. Because you know, we would hold that women are not called to pastoral ministry in the gender sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Elders reserved for males. But you're also, we also have this terminology throughout the New Testament of yoking, right? Marriage is a yoking,
Mm,
especially in First Corinthians. So So he's plowing, yes, in life, but also in ministry. He's plowing, and she's yoked. Pastor's wife is yoked to her husband, and so yes, her depression, her discouragements, or his burnout, his sin, his joy, all of those things. As you're plowing together, yes, he's the ox doing the bulk of the plowing, pastorally, but to just eliminate the wife's, perspective, role, counsel, her health in every sense of that word, to forget about that or to minimize that is foolish. So, yeah, I
Mm.
think I made some big, grand mistakes with my wife that are a big thing that I've learned, through all of this.
Mm.
The big thing that I learned was that I didn't give her a voice. So this situation, involved accusations. It involved, um, a variety of different things with people making, judgments or statements, and her not having the opportunity to even address those. And that's part of why I resigned was she didn't get approached as a member of the church who deserves, if she sinned, give her an opportunity to talk to the person she sinned against, allegedly.
Mm.
And that just wasn't afforded to her because of these people's perspective on sin and leadership in the home. They basically felt like the husband, the man, um, is the one responsible. Which at the end of the day, yes, I am responsible. But Matthew 18 doesn't say if your brother or sister sin, well, just if your brother, because if your sister sins against you, you can bypass her and go directly to her husband. So the Deuteronomy, old school, the soul who sins will die. In other words, it's not your father will be responsible, but you will, be responsible for your own sin. All that to be said, I didn't give her a voice. Um, I sort of overreacted and said, well, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. You're not going to do this, instead of allowing her to just process things and
Mm.
for her to initiate some of the things she could have initiated. I sort of shut all that down. And so I just, you know, I told her, if a burglar broke into our home, and I stood idly by and allowed that to take place, I have to own that. Um, but if she's waking me up screaming, and I'm just shushing her, um, then, she at least had the opportunity to raise her voice. And so we can go back, even years ago, some of the things she was voicing, I wasn't paying attention to. And so I've learned to now, and I'm still learning, by God's grace, but, to give a better, listening ear. There's those moments where Abraham did not regard the voice of his wife, and that was wise. But there are times that he needed to heed the voice of Sarah, and doing so was wise. So
Mm.
yeah, so that's kind of where I think I could have really allowed her to, sort of have a voice in the whole situation, really.
Mm. And what are some ways in which you would say that you've kind of been through this and you're maybe doing some writing, just thinking about it and trying to process it? What are some ways in which like you, you don't want to show a young seminarian how the sausage is made, so to speak, but sometimes you do want to remove some of the gloss that they might have from pastoral ministry. So what are some things that you would say, here's this from this situation that I can tell you, this is not par for the course, but this is not something that you should always expect, but here's some things that you can prepare for, or does that make sense what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Ways that you could apply what we went through to
Yeah.
pastoral, yeah, pastoral advice. I think this is sort of way bigger picture, but I think if you're planting a church, there's room for reforming your doctrine or your practice, but maybe have that dialed in before.
Mm.
I've talked to some friends who have just decided midstream, like, hey, we are not Baptist anymore. I mean, that's a big change. Yeah, we believe in paedo baptism. That's a huge change. And so if you have built your congregation, well, the Lord's building it, but if you've been laboring to feed and sustain a congregation on a specific doctrine, but then you're gonna completely, and again, there's room for reforming your theology, and hopefully you're always doing that, like just testing and improving it. But if you're going to change something, like expect that that's going to
Mm.
cause people who bought into those doctrines to want to push back or leave. Like just expect that. Don't be surprised by that. So I think that's a big thing. Bigger picture, um, is kind of know what you believe, and I think another big thing is just having outside accountability. So one huge thing that would have been avoided in our situation in particular, and I think again everyone on every side could agree with this, is there is great value no matter what your ecclesiology or your polity, no matter what. It's very wise to have an outside group of accountability, both for you as a pastor and for like top line issues with your congregation. So you may not be Presbyterian, and have the presbytery to kind of rely on. That's okay if you're a 1689, Baptist. They would use the language of messenger. You've got like-minded messengers who can step in and not necessarily make the bigger decisions, but they're there as a sounding board, and can offer counsel and advice. I think that's a key thing.
Mm.
Um, Today we have sort of the CEO, pastor model, the lone the lone ranger. You know what I mean? We've got the Moses model, and the thing that's funny is like even Moses completely relied on. He may have been the primary speaker, but he even had someone who also was a primary speaker. He had lots of people, in Exodus, what is it, 18, at Jethro's advice to have a lot of great men raised up around him to handle a bulk of the work. He would handle some of the bigger things, but a bulk of the work. So even if you don't hold to plurality of elders, there's still wisdom in having. Even Moses had Jethro, who was an outside counsel. So yeah, I think that would have been a big help. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but as far as like family dynamics, I also think if you're going through hardship as a pastor, um, you know, be willing to just make any decision necessary for the health of your family.
Mm.
I knew that if I didn't resign, it would have destroyed my wife. It would have destroyed my credible witness with my family, which would have
Mm.
destroyed my family. It's already tense enough as a pastor dad,
Mm.
to encourage your kids in their faith, to not bludgeon them with the expectations. We would come to church, and kids would say to my kids, and at their Christian school, like, "Oh, you're a pastor's kid." So whatever that means, it may mean you're a tyrant, or it may mean you're supposed to be perfect. Whatever that expectation is, we always told our kids, yes, you are a PK. Yep, that is true. You're a PK, Pilgrim's kid. And
That's
that
funny.
does not, there's no expectation. I might say something more like, we don't do that as a family because we're in Christ. So that behavior that you just had is not representative of our family, because that's not what we do as Christians. We're followers of God. But it's not, hey, you don't do that because you're the pastor's kid.
Mm.
I'm a pastor and you're not. So I think giving space for your family to process things, and to slow things, and to make any decision, right, even if it means laying down the awesome ministry that you planted, or you're a missionary, you got to come off the field forever. If it's, I mean, what are we talking about here? What's the trade-off? Like,
Mm.
there's no way you'll make a. I think sometimes we pit the two against one another.
Yes.
What's the higher priority, ministry or family? And again, if we're defining ministry as work that we do as unto Christ, right, then we really can't pit the two against each other,
No. No.
nor would we want to. So, yeah, being willing to lay down anything um, to make sure that our family is cared for, I think is a huge learn. And I would just caution guys against, well, I know it's not good for my kids, it's not good for my wife. And I'm not saying, okay, I'm quitting pastoral ministry a year in because they want to start a Wednesday service and I don't like stuff during the week. I'm not saying that, but when ministry becomes a detriment to the spiritual and overall health of your family, there's not only a red flag, but pump the brakes hard, and maybe even reconsider what the Lord's calling you to do.
Hmm. I can resonate with that only because I am a pastor's kid, and so
Mm.
I understand kind of all of the nuances that go along with that. So it sounds like that will be a chapter in that book about the ox. It sounds like that'll be a long chapter. No, I think that's really good, Pilgrim. And I, there is this burden that you sometimes feel, and it kind of goes back into that implicit, explicit thing, like where all of these expectations that people might have for you, they may, like you kind of mentioned, it was like the mistress. It's kind of like that thing that makes your eye kind of wander towards, I could be doing this over here, and you're forgetting the ministry of your own home. There's a book that was written by a 19th century contemporary of Spurgeon. His name is Octavius Winslow, and his stuff is really good. But the book is entitled "Ministry of Home." If you read it without that title in mind, you're like, oh wow, he's describing like church ministry, which is really interesting a lot of times. But actually, he's just talking about the ways in which there's a ministry that is being conducted within your own home. And I think thinking about it in that sort of way is really helpful, especially when it comes to that older notion: are we sacrificing our family on the altar of ministry and blah blah blah, all those things? No, there should never come a point where that occurs. And the priority of that, I think, is in the Word. The burden of that is in the Word. And it also kind of leads to like those questions that sometimes pastors have: are like, are they allowed to take breaks? Are they allowed to rest? What kind of rhythms should pastors have? Well, I think this is one of the things I also want to talk to you about, just because there, in certain circles, that's a conversation, but in some circles, it's not. It's this notion that pastors are always on, and no matter what, you're supposed to be able to access them, and no matter what, they're supposed to be at your beck and call, and no matter what, the rhythm of what a pastor doesn't really allow for leisure, doesn't allow for even vacation, doesn't allow for rest. And even if we don't think about that, functionally, maybe sometimes there is like the way that we there's like this level of processing that happens in theory, that just leads to that kind of just being the reality. So what would you say to pastors who kind of feel that burden, that they don't, like, their rhythms are just way too maxed out and they haven't had time to take a break?
Well, I mean, so I would say this very simply, very plainly: if you're not going to build in rhythms of rest and renewal, it'll be built in for you. In other words, if you won't take this, if you
Yeah,
won't take the break, it will be given to you without, without you volunteering for it.
that's
And
true.
so, like Barna in 2022, they found, I think it was 42% of pastors in the U.S. Were like feeling close to burnout.
Mm.
Um, and so I know there's another stat that Lifeway did. I think it was like plus 50, like 53% since 2020 had seriously considered quitting the ministry. And so you look at like the health markers, mental health, physical health, spiritual health. I mean, what do they always say? The cobbler's kids have no shoes. I had a friend who was like an incredible painter. He had this painting company, and I went to visit his house, and his house was in shambles as far as the exterior with the paint. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. This is a real thing. And so if that's true, then what are we saying about the potential spiritual
Mm.
health in our own life, let alone our homes?
Yeah.
Hopefully that's not the same trend, but this is a real thing. And I think this stoic sort of, I think it's a generation past. Okay, so this is maybe more of a boomer thing or an older thing. It's definitely like an 80s thing, but this whole like this, um, this is the gold standard. And what does it look like? This is success, right? It's dying in the pulpit, 50-year plus ministry, hardly ever taking a break. It's just this very stoic, no matter what, we push through it. I remember reading a like a contemporary story of a pastor whose wife passed away, and he left the hospital and went to work. He went to church that day. He wanted to get
Mm,
some stuff done at church, and I'm like that. And
mm,
it was conveyed in like a positive light. Like, wow, what a hard worker. And I think that is like the definition of unhealth in a pastor's
yeah,
life. You know, it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
and so yeah, I think this notion of oh, what do you mean you get a vacation? What do you mean pastors get a day off? I remember I sat with a young couple who had been pretty spiritually abused at a well-known ministry, national ministry. Um, and there's some abuse scandals kind of being exposed right now. But I remember sitting with them, trying to counsel them through their hurt, and I said, yeah. So we have a plurality of elders and ministry leaders, care team. I don't keep my phone in my room at night. My wife and I put our cell phones out on the charger, out in the living room. If there's a death somewhere that it's an absolute emergency, people know where I live. They can come knock on the door. I'll hear the door. Um, but I'm not on call. I'm not just, 24/7, anytime, any place, at my kids' games, on a date, in the middle of movie night. You can just reach me and hey, Pastor, we need to meet. Those devastating texts that you get that keep you up stressed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think, we can get more into this, but the wisdom of building in regular rhythms of renewal and rest, like regularly, build them in as habits. You can use whatever phrase, spiritual discipline, spiritual formation, what habits of grace, whatever you want to call them, but we've got to learn this like right out of the gate and make this as normative as brushing our teeth, as taking
Mm,
showers, shampooing our hair. It's got to be built into our lives. And I think Jesus demonstrates, uh, if anyone was needed for 3 years, God incarnate was needed in Judea doing ministry from sunset, sunrise to sunset and even beyond. And what does Jesus model for us? There's other work to do. He steps away. Hey, let's get aside for some rest. And if you
mm.
look at some of the rhythms of that, sometimes that was when ministry was bustling. And he could have stayed. There's other work to do. And so even the Son of God, right, with the energy of the Holy Spirit, gives us, I think, a great template of what rhythms of rest, and I use that a lot. Rhythms of rest and renewal kind of look like.
What would that look like for a younger pastor, for a guy who's fresh into ministry? How does he build up those rhythms, as you're calling them, or how does he establish those kind of boundaries um, in ways that are gracious, but are also ways that speak to what he values, and I think biblically so.
Well, I mean, you don't have to be a Sabbatarian, right, to see the value in taking a day of rest every week. And I don't think, that means you don't go into the church building. I think that means you're in nature, you're with your family, with loved ones, you are enjoying God's creation, and you're reflecting on, your gratitude for the goodness of God. You paint that picture to young people, and it's sort of like it like blows their mind. Like, wait, I can do this every week. This is something God has gifted to us, right? He didn't create man for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for man. This is
Yeah,
for
yeah.
me. And Israel ignores it. He says every 7 years, I want you to give the land a rest, and they go, no, we're going to skip that one, and they do that almost 500 years. So he says, okay, I'll take you out for 70, and I'll give the land a rest. So again, you're either going to build this into your life in practical ways,
Hmm.
built into your actual, like baked into your calendar. When I say rhythms, I mean I'm not trying to be poetic. I mean literally, God has given us the rhythm of the day, right? So the day can begin and end, in a variety of different ways. The alarm can go off or not. You can jump up and just get right into work mode. Open your laptop, start sending that email, or you can take a minute and let me just pause for a minute. Let me express some gratitude for this day. Let me take some time to like consider my life, consider where I was yesterday, consider where I am today. Let me take some time to, seek the Lord. Let me read his word. Let me pray. Let me exercise, get my body, blood flowing. Again, he's given that to us on the daily, and I think, it's built into the week, in not only in creation, but in the Ten Commandments. He's built that in. Um, I think, even the month. I like to take the month and say, okay, what a cool thing, like that, this follows maybe more the moon rhythms, but like, hey, we actually mark calendars, right? And so like here we are in, currently in December, but that's going to end, and we're going to start a new month. So man, maybe I should take some time. And there seems to be a really high emphasis in scripture on remembering, right?
Mm.
Stop and remember. And so why don't I just bake that into my actual schedule? Why don't I, for me personally, it's like the last Wednesday, or now it's become the first Wednesday of every month, just stopping and looking back. And so I think for pastors as well, taking vacation time, not just to get away and like, oh man, I need a day off, or I need a week off. We actually, when I was full-time lead pastoring, we used to take Mondays off, and it was almost like we're exhausted. Oh, finally, get a day off. If that's what your day off looks like, oh, finally, um, I think you might be missing the whole point of a day of rest. So we switched it to Friday. So I'd get all my work done, and then say, okay, now it's time, like built into creation. God doesn't take the day off, then get to work. He works, then rests. So we would take Friday off, and my wife said, I immediately saw the difference. Um, you're not sort of reflecting on Sunday, discouraged, wishing you could do something else, which we all sometimes feel Sunday or Monday. But
Yep.
you're rested, you're refreshed. That allows me to go into Sundays, again, not exhausted, but revitalized. So I think building that into your calendar, and then yeah, taking vacation time, vacation or naps, I think are spiritual reminders to us that God is sovereign.
Mm.
So a nap says it doesn't depend on me. God's sovereign. I can rest.
Mm.
They don't need me. A vacation says to the church and to you, God is sovereign. He is Lord. He's the shepherd of this church. He's the pastor. I am under
That's
him,
right.
but I'm
That's
going to
right.
take a day of rest or a week of rest. So I think those are important.
I very quickly did the same thing when I started pastoring here. I was taking Mondays off, and there was always this feeling when I got into the office on Tuesday that I was already behind in the week, and I would be thinking about those things all day Monday, so I wasn't really relaxing. I wasn't really resting. So now the rhythm just feels a lot better for me, and sometimes there is some stuff that bleeds into Fridays, but I try to safeguard that as much as possible. But Fridays and Saturdays just being very um, strict with, and deliberate with who I'm spending time with and how I'm spending those hours, and hopefully, Lord willing, doing so in a way that's meaningful, that's actually quality, and that's actually doing something for my family and for my soul, so to speak. So I think that's really important, and I think that maybe there's a book in there too, or maybe someone's already read it or written it, but there's something to all of those times where it says that Jesus went away. Um, there's something to that, obviously. Like, it's not by accident that I think the book of Mark mentions it a lot, where as you said, like, there's ministry that's bustling, and then all of a sudden, wait, where's Jesus? Oh yeah, he's up in the mountains praying. He's not in the heat of the so-called like bustling ministry that's happening. He's actually taking some time. He's doing something that is actually restful, that is able to, and he's doing so in a way that I think is tangible, but also in a way that's substitutionary. Like, he's doing it as an example as well as just for, he's human and God at the same time. So, anyways, I think that's really really important for no matter what age you are. Pastors taking rest and I think being free to do so. I think one of the things. So, not to keep circling back to the same topic, but you mentioned sheep bite. And I think there's also this there's two things that I think that are sometimes taboo for pastors to talk about, which is number one, taking a break, and number two, people in your church biting you. People in your church, and this is not to just air dirty laundry. It's just to say that
Sure.
you're in ministry with sinners, and sinners are going to sin, and whether they do so knowingly or whether they do so, ignorantly, there's going to be ways in which you feel the effects of that. We are sinners who are ministering to other sinners, so it goes both ways. It goes full circle, and I think what I've found, and not in any profound way, but what I'm learning and finding is that pastors, as we've been saying, they're children of God, and they should, and they are, but they should feel free to be able to process some of these very things. What does it mean to rest? How can I do that? What does it mean to be bitten by the sheep with whom I'm ministering, that I'm pouring my souls out to, and not just feeling as though they have to keep all of that stuff bottled up? Because if you take that and you kind of divorce that from pastoral ministry, we would tell anyone bottling that up, not going to go well for you. It doesn't matter what the context is. That is going to do you in at some point. Like you were saying, if you don't take a break, God's going to give you one anyways. The same sort of things, whether that feeling of exhaustion comes from just your schedule or it comes from sheep biting. I think part of the process of healing, but learning and coping and kind of getting through those seasons is being able to process those, and sometimes out loud. And whether that's with, as you're saying, I think most specifically, someone who is like an accountability partner for you, someone with whom you can really bare your soul and be able to process those things out loud and feel free enough to be vulnerable. Pastoral vulnerability, I think, is one of those areas that we haven't done a good job of cultivating. And I don't mean to say that anecdotally and just, painting with broad brushes, but generally speaking, pastors are not allowed to be that vulnerable. We look at them with a little bit of a side eye. Whoa, what kind of pastor is that guy? Look at that guy. And that's kind of to the church's detriment. That's kind of it's kind of to our shame that we've kind of cultivated that culture within the church, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to understand that there are job hazards. There's hazards on the job. So if we were to be miners in Kentucky, there are some significant hazards, right? And so like they found that, the three most stress-inducing jobs, and I don't remember which study did this, but the top three, like most stress-inducing jobs: President of the United States, CEO of a hospital, pastor of a 100-person church.
Hmm.
And so, I think just understanding the hazards of the job. What this is going to involve is it's going to take a major, like your body keeps the receipts. It's going to take a major toll
Hmm.
emotionally and physiological, like psychosomatic, whatever you want to say. It's going to take a major emotional toll because your job, right? You're a soul care practitioner as a pastor, right? So your job is to come alongside people and to guide them, right, through the valley of the shadow of death, sometimes alongside still water into green pasture. And so we're not cowboys, right? I like to say we're not cowboys who are driving cattle. We don't push the sheep and, push the cattle and crack the whip and threaten and get loud. We're called to lead. So we're out in front as also sheep following the good shepherd. And we're saying, like Paul, follow me as I follow Christ. So that means we're close enough in that personal relationship where we're not just on the stage or just on the screen. We're building lives in close proximity, and they can look at us and say, I will follow you. Because what did Paul tell Timothy? You know my life. What did he say? You know what you believed and from whom
Hmm.
you've learned it, right?
Yeah.
He'd
Yeah.
say, watch your life and doctrine closely, right? That means you've got people around you. So, yeah, the hard part about church dynamics is that, one person said, we're like porcupines in the cold. So in one sense, we we want to huddle together because it's cold, it's frigid, and so we get near one another, but then we get too close and we harm one another. And so then they said, you know, Christianity is a constant pushing. What is it? A constant pulling away and drawing near, pulling away and drawing near to believers. I use this phrase, beautiful irritation.
Hmm.
And so, you know, iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. You know, let's not like overlook that word picture. Iron sharpening iron. Some one of the pieces or the other are causing sparks, but they're also like in that friction reducing, right, the mass of that of that iron to make it more effective, to make it more useful.
Hmm.
But in that close proximity, there's rubbing, and it's not it's hot and it's not great. And so I think, you know, it's an irritation when we're among the local church, among believers, and it's a beautiful irritation because we're helping produce, you know, Christ likeness. I think of the Great Commission, and you know, Jesus, of course, says there, go disciple the nations, and here's how you do it. You baptize them. So, like, if they've not heard the name of Christ, preach obviously, so that they become followers of Christ. They're baptized, and then I think we misunderstand this next part. You know, the going is the important part because they haven't heard. Then once they hear, you know, see them, follow them through to discipleship and baptism into the church. But then the third part, I think we misquote, and I think we say teaching them all that I've commanded you. That's not what he said. He says teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. So it's easy to just teach. We're just going to teach. But Jesus doesn't say, just teach them what I told you. No, he says, teach them to observe. So that observing part is where we have to shepherd and model and be in close enough proximity that, yeah, we pour our lives
Hmm.
into families. And, you know, I sort of caricatured it earlier, but every pastor watching this or listening to this knows exactly what I mean by the phone call of, hey, or the text, it's now text. Hey, pastor, can we meet this week? We have to talk to you. We have some
Hmm.
concerns. Or, hey, do you have time to meet? We all know we're all getting, you know, anxiety right now just thinking of what that conversation is going to look like.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, I just would not meet. I refused to meet with someone who wouldn't tell me ahead of time. And I think that's a best practice, honestly. But if they said, you know, if they said, well, the reason I want to meet is we're leaving the church, then I'd say, great, we're going to meet with the elders, and I'm not going to meet alone, especially with my wife and my kids. We're going to dinner with them. We're having them over, even worse, trying to be hospitable, and then they drop that shoe on us. But you know, I think that is the hazard in the job, is that we love people, we're laying down our lives, so baked into that is that we are going to be deeply, deeply hurt because you know, I remember I met with a family at our church in Tampa, and his wife had sadly a pretty significantly late miscarriage, and so she delivered their baby stillborn, and it was incredibly hard. He called me up, and I'm sorry this is a little graphic. I just want the nature of what happened, but he called me up and just said, I don't know what to do. We have the baby. What do I do? And so, you know, what do you do in those situations? I said, well, we should get probably a hospital involved. Do you want to do a funeral, you know, a burial? But, you know, no quick verse, you know, we're not going to be able to
Hmm.
chat GPT that. You know what I mean? We've got to show up. We got to be embodied. We've got to like counsel them through that. We got to cry with them. We got to sit with them, and we got to wear that. You know that, and that's what Christ did. You know, Christ didn't from afar just send an angel, you know, to proclaim the good news. He came and he wore it. He bore, you know, as you know, like all of humanity, everything it meant to be human, and then bore our sin. And so that's what we do. We're called to do the same. We are, right. We are like, I don't want to be blasphemous here. Like we're not God incarnate. We're not even Christ incarnate, but we're like bearing bodily, right? The work that Jesus, the gospel, right? And we say it cliche, you know, we're the hands and feet of Jesus, but pastorally, we really are. And I think that's where some church hurt is, oh, you are the only thing I knew about Christ was you. And so you've hurt me, therefore Christ has hurt me, I'm out. But I
Mm,
think, for that one particular couple, a few months later, after walking them through that, just in a very trite way, be like, oh, hey, we found another church. For them, that was sort of an easy decision. It was born out of convenience and what worked best. For my wife and I, that was like, like, we can't separate, we can't divorce you know, the ministry that we've done to you and with you and the love we have for you. To you, it's just very easy to say, oh, we've found another fellowship. Can you transfer our membership? For us, it was just like, oh, they're like family. And when you have a family member, leave or divorce, that just, it's devastating. So yeah, I think, anyway, long answer, but I think that's, it's part of the job. And that's what we signed up for. We signed up to be, the gospel incarnate in some ways, to just you know, be in close proximity. And that means we're opening ourselves up for great betrayal, great hurt, great, misunderstanding,
mm,
expectations. I wish I could go back. The biggest thing my wife and I feel as far as pain is we wish that we could go back and help those who left, with the confusion of us leaving. And we wish we could just address those people originally and just say, like, man, we are sorry. We love you. We don't want to, we wish we could go back and all this could be undone.
mm,
But that's where we're hurting is like, oh man, it's people, not situations, not principles, but people. So,
yeah.
um, that's the heart of Christ, I think, is, a pastor who loves the people and cares for them. So,
Amen. But that's really good too, what you mentioned. Even though we're not like, we are not Jesus incarnate in the ways that we minister. What you were getting at made me think of that verse from 2 Corinthians 4, where, Paul's talking about the jars of clay, and then he says, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed. And he goes on from there. But in verse 10, he says, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our
mm,
bodies. And you get this picture
yeah.
that on Paul's actual physical body, there were marks of ministry, whether that's the
Mm,
strain of it, whether it's the fact that, he had been beaten to a pulp almost to death a couple times, or, whether he had the effects of being shipwrecked, whatever it might have been, or even just the weight, as he says later on in 2 Corinthians, of his
right.
anxiety for all the churches, whatever it might have been. It's not it's not that he's incarnate for the ministry of Jesus, but he's a conduit of
Yeah.
the ministry of Jesus, who was God incarnate for us. And as a conduit of that, as a channel of that, as a vessel, to use the jar of clay analogy, as a vessel of that, he himself bears those same marks in a lot of ways. And that, again, kind of leads us to that notion of just being there, being present, in ways that are uncomfortable, ways that are maybe anxiety inducing, ways that maybe is not always convenient. But as you were saying, that this is quote unquote the hazards of the job, so to speak. This is kind of par for the course. And again, what a privilege it is that we get to do that. I think that's the thing. Like, hopefully, no one kind of gets this as we're like, pulling back the curtain of some of the frustrations of ministry, that we're like, oh, just two people licking our wounds. But actually, there is so much joy and privilege in this too. And I think even Paul, um, you read his letters, and he never got over the fact that he was called to be an apostle. And like you read First Timothy, and he talks about like what a marvel it is that he's been made an example of God's mercy, by
Yeah.
being the chief of sinners to whom the salvation of Christ comes. Like you just get the sense that he never got over that, despite all of the headaches, like despite all of the annoyances that he had with churches and congregations, and people slandering him and people leaving him, like you mentioned, Demas. Throughout all of that, he counted it all joy to serve the Lord, to spend and be spent for Christ. And so, even I think, even as we're talking about rhythms and schedules and and not putting ourselves in unhealthy situations and so on and so forth. There's a great joy to be found in ministering for Jesus, to having even maybe some of our these same sort of scars and marks be born in our body too. And I think that's the tension. That there is some frustration, but there is just deep and profound joy at the same time. And it comes from just the fact that, we get to take part in this, like you've been saying this over and over again in this pod. We get to take part in this kingdom work. What a marvel is that? Like, the kingdom is going to come in no matter what. We just get to take part in announcing it's coming. So, like, what a great joy that we have. Like, that's our role. That's our job description. So, anyways, there's a great joy to be had there too.
Yeah, yeah. I like to use that, maybe out of context, but when Paul asks, who is sufficient for these things? The answer is
Yeah.
not us. We
Nope.
are not, but like you mentioned earlier, where we are lacking, it's not we doing the work, it's the grace of God in us. And, you mentioned that verse about, Paul, the least. People have written on this, but it's pretty interesting. He kind of progresses from so over time, his awareness of who he is, um, sort of in his own eyes diminishes. So he starts off like, I'm the least of the apostles, and then like a little bit later on in ministry, he's like, I'm the least of the saints, and then by the end, he's like, I'm the chief of sinners. I think the longer Paul goes on, it's just, he must become, it's a John principle. He must become greater, I must become less. But
Mm,
I think that's wise in ministry. We can start out like, hey, I'm God's gift to ministry. I'm ready to crush this. I'm going to go for it. And I think after you find a few wounds and you get some years under your belt, you go, wow, like, yeah, I think there should be a growing appreciation for the grace and mercy of God and the fact that we get to do, what an honor, what a joy. Who's sufficient for these things? It's not me. I'm not God's gift to anything. God's
mm,
gift to me is to pluck me out of the fire, and set my feet on a rock. There's a pastor friend of mine who has a picture right next to his desk, and it's a turtle on top of a fence post, and just literally just full on the legs hanging off, and it's a conversation starter. And so the obvious question is, well, he'll say, so how did the turtle get there? And people don't know what to say, and he says, someone had to put them there, and he says, that's me. I was put in this role, put in this, I've been called to this. I
mm.
certainly am not sufficient to keep myself here, but praise be to God, who gives us the victory.
Amen.
Otherwise, let's get out of it.
Pilgrim, thank you so much for your time today. There's so much more I want to chat with you about, so hopefully maybe this will be part one of a little mini series. I don't know, but I'm so
Sure.
thankful for your friendship and your connection and your heart for ministry, and I'll be praying for you and your family. And again, just thanks for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.